Welcome back, everyone, to theCUBE's live coverage of Red Hat Summit Ansible Fest here in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm your host, Rebecca Knight, alongside my co-host and analyst, Rob Strechay. One of the things that always comes through with Red Hat is just what a community it is. And I don't know if it's the open source thing, but you just really feel that there's so much community-driven innovation that goes on.
Absolutely. I think that's the whole heart of open source, and it's really embodied at Summit every year. And I think, again, it's great to also see some of our friendly faces back as well.
Yes, indeed. And a very friendly face is sitting right here. Mo Duffy, Distinguished Engineer and Manager, Software Engineering here at Red Hat. Thank you so much for returning to theCUBE. A theCUBE alum, in addition to being a distinguished engineer.
That's right.
So I want to start by sort of riffing a little bit on what Rob and I were just saying. I mean, Red Hat is open source is Red Hat. How, in your estimation, can open source communities help shape the future of AI in ways that reflect the real needs of what customers are looking for?
Well, I would say the big hole in a lot of like the AI this and AI that is, what problem is it going to solve? And the community has a lot of problems out there. And if it's your problem, you're motivated to solve it. So I think what's important with open source is to make the tools to work with AI accessible and easy to use, so that folks who have that itch to scratch, that they have that problem they've got to solve, that they have the deep expertise to understand this is my problem domain, to be able to apply AI tooling to it and learn those interesting new use cases that it could be applied towards. I think that applying AI to specific problems is what's going to develop the technology to be more useful.
So I think, again, you just came from doing a session, and you see a lot of what's going on. What was the topic of the session, and how did it go?
Sure. So I did a session with Stephen O'Grady from RedMonk, and we talked about open source AI and how it isn't actually a thing, because open source is something that we use to describe source code for code. And AI, like AI models, like there's code involved, there's code that's part of it, but there's also data and there's parameters, and they don't actually map to our understanding of what code is. And so, even applying licenses that were meant for software to these things that are not software sort of muddies the water. So we kind of did a walkthrough of like, listen, like, these are the different ways that you could view these different artifacts that make up a model. These are different licenses that are, say, OSI approved that could apply to each of these types of artifacts. And by the way, like, nobody knows, we're all learning this together, but we have two main frameworks to look at it right now. And that's the OSI's open source AI definition, and then the Linux Foundation AI's MOF framework for examining like what class of model is this. So we kind of went through that. And the final thing that we went through is sort of, what is the implication for your business? Like, if you care about IP risk, look at models that offer indemnification, like IBM's Granite. If you care about being able to ship this in a product that you give to customers, make sure you're in touch with your legal department. Make sure they're reviewing, because there's usage restrictions in models that are called open source that open source doesn't have. So if you're used to working with open source code, the same rules don't apply.
And we should mention that it was a standing room only audience that it was. People were clamoring to get in, didn't you? So I believe it was just this last year that Instruct Lab was the new kid on the block. And I'm curious to hear what role Instruct Lab is now playing in accelerating AI innovation.
Sure. So I think basically fine-tuning is sort of a difficult thing to do if you don't have deep expertise. And it basically offers you this open source toolkit to sort of approach that technique of fine-tuning in like a very nicely defined way. So I think it just makes it more accessible. Like we just talked about, like in the beginning of this, like, how is open source going to shape AI? It's going to make the tooling accessible so that people with specific domain knowledge can apply it. So
why don't we dig in a little deeper on the democratization of AI, and what role do you see open source really playing in doing that? Because you talked about how maybe it's not the models per se, and it's, bring your own model, train it, and, fine tune it and deploy it. But maybe it's other pieces of it.
Yeah. So what we're finding, especially with experiments in the community with different projects we've been doing, is the data matters too. And like even you could have the same exact data set and everything else in the pipeline exactly the same, but you're processing the data slightly differently, you're cleaning it slightly differently, and you're going to get different results. So thinking through like what data are you bringing to bear into the whole system, that has some impact. The other thing that might not like be as, I would say, like as obvious is I think over time, I will say I learned how to use Linux as a high school student on the family computer. It was a normal computer. Like not every high school kid today has an 8x100 system at their fingertips to experiment and learn with this stuff. So there's a little bit of a technical barrier in terms of like not having the hardware or the access to the tools you actually need to experiment with it. So I think over time, as sort of the hardware requirements to play with this come down, and then the hardware becomes more available as new forms of hardware come out, and then the other stuff gets older and more affordable, I think we're going to see more and more open source availability as well, because people in the community are going to have better access. Like that high school kid or the kid in college working on their thesis, they're going to actually be able to get access to the hardware. I think that that's one of the biggest things holding back innovation.
Well, what about the ethos too, in terms of what can those AI developers learn from open source and the mindset and the ethos that goes along with it when it comes to integrating users? And as you said, from when you started this conversation, thinking about the problem you're trying to solve, thinking about it from the perspective of the person with the problem.
Yeah.
So how do you think about that kind of ethos and mindset?
I think it's the classic engineering versus UX kind of thing, where it's like engineering is like, man, this tech, oh gosh, it's so cool and I want to play with it. But like UX is like, yeah, but what does it do? Like, how does it actually solve a problem for people? And I think in the same way, like the AI technologists, they're like, oh my God, and we came up with this new technique and it's like this new model that does all this stuff. But other folks are just like, okay, cool. What does that mean for me? What can it do for me? It's great you came up with this new technique, but I have to solve this problem. I need to, become more efficient at this part of my business, or I want to go through this data set and get new insights. How does that help? Right? So it's almost, it's like the same problem with like new clothes. I see it.
So you have a Podman desktop shirt on, and you have the Red Hat pin and you have the Red Hat earrings. I just want to point that out. So good bling for today. But Podman desktop in particular, I mean, I look at it and go, I have a son who's about to graduate next year from Arizona State with a computer science degree, and we were talking about this and how they're getting into this, and they're talking about how they, to your point, how they kind of scale down to be able to play with things. And then, Rebecca brought up Instruct Lab, which is one of my favorite things because you can go make the synthetic data and things like that. You don't need a full data set.
Exactly.
How do you see like people jumping in? Because it is really complicated to a lot, and there's a lot of skills out there that just don't exist in a lot of organizations.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing about it, like it can seem overwhelming, but the thing, and this is something we said in the talk earlier today, we're all learning this together as an industry. It's not like if you're just starting out and you're trying to figure out like, how does this work or how does it, everyone is learning it right now. So don't feel like less than or whatever because you're on the same playing field as everybody else. And it's just like, you have to have that love for the technology. This is just like the next new toy to play with. So just dive in and play with it and see what, I think there is nothing, like you cannot argue with somebody actually building a prototype to solve a problem. Like you can opine all you want about, well, it should do this or it should do that, but like show me something working, like play with it. And that's what open source enables because you have access to all the frameworks, you have access to the open weight models, and you can build a thing. And Podman Desktop's a great way to get started because we have the Podman Desktop AI Lab that it gives you some recipes to start out. It gives you a set of openly licensed models, and you can just start going.
So as you said, some we're all starting. It's a level playing field right now, but some people do have more expertise than others, of course. When you think about this and you think about best practices that have emerged in terms of the organizations you're seeing that are doing a great job of building AI tools that are transparent, explainable, and accountable to users, what comes to mind and what's your advice on how to replicate what they're doing?
I would say the thing that I see when I see like a successful POC or a successful prototype or something launching in production successful using this tech is like just the obsessive focus on the problem to solve. It just always comes back to that. If you're just playing around with toys, you're playing around with toys. But once you've learned enough from that and you have the problem to solve, just relentlessly focusing on it and making sure, like measuring each step and making sure you're getting closer and closer. And having I would say also the depth, not just in AI, but in the problem to solve, like in that domain. Like for example, like right now I'm working on the RHEL Lightspeed team. I'm actually super jazzed about this role because I have some depth in AI from working on the InstructLab and RHEL AI projects for the past year, but I have a lot of depth in Linux. So it's like that I think that where you have two things intersecting and you have like the depth that you're applying this other thing to it, like who else in the world could apply amazing AI to Linux than Red Hat? So I'm like super excited to see what comes out of this project.
So with the standing room only, appearance that you just made and everything, how do you see the people that are in the room here this week? What personas are you seeing, and what are some of the questions that you got asked as you're running to come beyond here?
Sure. Definitely. Well, a lot of questions about the slides. So one of the things that we did during the presentation is we broke down models into sort of the pipelines that are made to build them, and then listed out all the artifacts. And we classified the different artifacts based in 3 categories. It's data, code, and parameters. And that's from the OSI's open source AI definition. And we kind of, through each pipeline, we went through the pre-training phase, the fine-tuning phase, and the inference phase. And we just called out all of this stuff. And I basically said, listen, like, this is a vegetable soup, and these are not all carrots. And carrots have one license, and peas have another. Like, you cannot treat it as this monolith. And I think people really liked the way that it was broken down. So a lot of people came up with just like, where's the slides? I got to have those slides. We also came up with a set of questions when you're looking to deploy AI in your enterprise. These are the things you should be asking. Like, for instance, like, talk to your legal department. Are you able to redistribute if you fine-tune this model? Can you include this model in a commercial product? What intellectual property was used in the pre-training data? Is that disclosed? And like, we kind of had a set of questions, so folks were asking about those too.
So because people are going to see this and now ask, where are the slides?
I'll upload them to the Summit website. They'll be there, I promise.
But what you're talking about is really having people who are willing to share, willing to help, and that is such a part of the Red Hat way, the Red Hatter way. Can you talk a little bit about what your advice to organizations and senior leaders about investing in community mentorship and education as really equally important, if not more so, than just investing in the tech?
So when you say community, how would you define it in that?
Well, I mean, helping other people learn how to use these things, how to define the problems, and how to understand what they're working on.
I would say if the idea is kind of communicating to leadership, this is why it makes sense to invest in community. I mean, there's a give and take there. Like, if you have an expertise, say your expertise is in AI, and what is going to drive that forward is having a clear use case, then work with organizations that have a clear use case and bring the tech to mind. Like, okay, well, maybe we can partner. You understand this domain, and we understand this. We'll partner together and build a solution together. I mean, that's an obvious one. I think just anytime you have people with different perspectives coming together, like the classic UX engineering, or, that's where the magic happens. When you take two perspectives and mix them together, that's when you get innovation. If you just stay in your lane, you're just going to be checking off the things that you've always done the way you've always done them. And when you inject a little bit of variety into the mix and a little bit of a different outlook, then that's where you do something net new, and that's where you create value.
One of the big things that we've been talking about is, it's a big topic around the world in general, is responsible AI, is trustworthy AI, it's efficiency with AI and sustainability around that. Where do you see, from a trust perspective, open source playing a role?
Well, I think I would say, and this definitely a touchy subject, because the OSI open source AI definition. There was definitely a lot of vigorous discourse around it. I say that if you know where the data came from, then you can trust the output of the model. And if you don't know where the data came from, you're not really sure what's going to come out of it, right? So I think that and I don't always know that it applies because there's a lot of nuance. Like we said in our talk earlier today, like, a model isn't exactly one-to-one with source code. But I think that when you try to be as transparent and open as possible with every artifact and the means of production of the artifacts, that's where you get trust because people know where you're coming from. They know what was used. They know what went into it. Whenever anything is sort of boxed, like a black box, that's where it's you can't trust it based on what it is because you don't know what it is. So then it becomes, like the logos, ethos, pathos. It's like the ethos of who produced it and do you trust that entity, right? So that's where and it's just an easy thing. Well, I say that, but it is an easy thing. If you want to build trust on the thing you're building, be transparent about what went into it, how you made it. And I think that's the open source way,
So we're here at the Red Hat Summit. This is not your first rodeo, of course. What are you most looking forward to, and what are the kinds of conversations that you're having that really speak to the moment that we're all living in right now with the innovation that's taking place with AI?
So I think last year was sort of, I would say like when we talked to KubeCon EU, it was like the first KubeCon, like after the big AI thing that like everybody had time to make talks about it, right? So like this year, it's a little bit, people have had time to play around. So this is the year where I'm excited. I've already started conversations talking to folks like, so what's actually working and what's not? Because I think that it's sort of like like this grand experiment where we're trying this, try out, and like learning what works, what doesn't, what needs more tweaking. So I'm excited to sort of hear the results of what everybody's been doing over the past year and see what works, and we figure out what the next direction to go in.
How do you see, because again, being a global company and you hear things and there's people from all over the world that are here this week, how do you see some of the people that there's different approaches from different governments around regulation and you're an open source company trying to deal with all of this. Like, again, to your point, always check with your lawyer.
Always check with a lawyer.
I totally agree with that. I've done.
I am not a lawyer, by the way.
I've done open source licensing. I fully agree with you that some of the terms in some of these models I've looked at them are pretty sneaky.
Yeah.
And and like you said, they say they're open, but even in open source licenses, your mileage varies about how open are they really? Are they shift left? Are they all of the different types of requirements that they put on you? How do you see the different perspectives coming in from around the world that is the open source, I don't want to say it's competitive between open source versus the regulation, but one is almost leading the other and we kind of see this vacillation back and forth?
I would say some of it is sort of a geopolitical thing. You know what I mean? Like, there's certain countries that have the benefit of this technology and being very far ahead, and then like the countries that aren't there are somewhat afraid. So I think that kind of comes into it. In terms of like applying sort of the approach of how you regulate AI, I see a lot of fear. And I think that some of that, there's the fear from the machines are coming to take our jobs to, it's matrix algebra, guys, like, yeah. Simmer down. And then there's fears of like, well, these countries are so powerful or these companies are so powerful. Are we going to turn into a dystopian future or, and I just think that governments are trying to protect their citizens and they're trying to protect the public good. And I think that whenever you go just to your basic open source principles, it's sort of a unifying thing. Because again, like I said, if it's open, if it's transparent, if you know what went into it, it becomes a lot less scary. It's like the classic moment in A Wizard of Oz where you go behind the curtain. It's like, oh yeah, okay, it's just this guy, right? So I think open source will have a role to play with AI in terms of regulation, just from the fact that if you can see how it was made, if you can understand what went into it, then you can have a little bit more trust and have a more informed conversation about it.
Excellent. Great advice. Thank you so much, Mo Duffy. Thank you so much for coming on theCUBE. I'm Rebecca Knight for Rob Strechay. Stay tuned for more of theCUBE's live coverage of Red Hat Summit Ansible Fest. You're watching theCUBE, the leader in enterprise tech news and analysis.